Hello everyone, I am the Canadian Gaming Penguin. Have you ever wanted to play an MMO but had no idea what MMO meant, nor had any idea which game to try? Or more specifically, have you ever wanted to play Final Fantasy XIV online? Or have you just started playing Final Fantasy XIV? In this video, I will be giving an introduction to MMOs in general, and an introduction specifically to Final Fantasy XIV Online. I will explain some basic terminology that is commonly used in MMOs and how that terminology applies to Final Fantasy XIV. Additionally, I will be explaining what some terminology means that is specifically used in Final Fantasy XIV. I've divided this video into sections to hopefully help prevent information overload. Additionally, I will have other videos in the future that will go into more depth with some of these topics. To begin, just what does MMO mean? MMO is the acronym for Massively Multiplayer Online. In the case of Final Fantasy XIV Online, this game is an MMO RPG. That is, it is a massively multiplayer online role-playing game. MMO RPG. The basic concept of an MMO is that it is a game played with other people online, that is, through the internet. As an RPG, role-playing game, you assume the role of a character and take control of that character's actions. In Final Fantasy XIV, you assume the role of an adventurer that explores, aids various peoples, and fights various enemies in the persistent world of Hydaelyn in the region of Eorzea. When I say persistent world, I mean this. It is a virtual world which has its own internal clock, and events continue to occur even when players are not online or interacting with it. The virtual world is shared by all players, which allows them to interact with each other and the environment. An example of an event that may occur while you are offline is if you are growing something in a garden. This plant will continue to grow even when you are not logged into the game. In Final Fantasy XIV, each player has a main storyline to progress through, which for the most part is a solo player experience. The exceptions are when a player needs to do dungeons, trials, etc. that are part of the storyline. I will get into more details about dungeons and trials in a future video. There are other quests, namely side quests, that are for lore purposes and for helping you gain experience. Side quests may also reward gear, potions, etc. The rewards are shown before accepting a quest. Other quests in the game unlock other features of the game, such as additional dungeons, trials, raids, alliance raids, etc. Before I get further into this video, if you aren't sure that Final Fantasy XIV Online is the MMO you are looking for, or if you're not sure that MMOs are in fact something that you're interested in, then you may want to consider trying the free trial for Final Fantasy XIV. Square Enix recently updated the trial version of the game to include all of the base game, A Realm Reborn, and the first expansion, Heavensward. There are some restrictions to some game features that you can access in the free trial. I will leave a link down in the description below that lists all these restrictions. Included in that link is a how-to install, access, etc. the trial version of the game. The trial version will give you access to hours upon hours of content for free with no time limit. The character you create in the trial version can be used if or when you purchase and subscribe to the game. When you first register the game, that is, the purchased version, you will be given 30 days of game time. Thus, your first subscription payment would not be until after that 30 days. Moving on to talk about some terminology used in MMOs. Many MMOs have different classes or jobs that take on different roles. These roles are typically tank, healer, and DPS. DPS stands for damage per second. The tank, healer, and DPS roles are the combat-based roles. In Final Fantasy XIV, there are additional roles, crafting and gathering. These roles are non-combat-based roles. In Final Fantasy XIV, the roles are divided into different categories. The tank, healer, and DPS fall under the categories of Disciple of War, DOW, and Disciple of Magic, DOM. I will explain the differences of these categories later in this video. Crafting is categorized as Disciple of Hand, DOH, and the Gathering is categorized as Disciple of Land, DOL. In Final Fantasy XIV, as I mentioned a moment ago, there are different combat-based roles: tank, healer, and DPS. The DPS role in Final Fantasy XIV is subdivided further into melee DPS, physical ranged DPS, and magical ranged DPS. Within these roles of tank, healer, and DPS, there are classes and jobs. A class is, in the case of Final Fantasy XIV, the combat-based focus that your character has initially. For example, if I were an archer, my combat-based focus would be ranged attacks with a bow and arrows. A job works in the same way as a class. Some of the jobs in Final Fantasy XIV have starting classes. For example, Gladiator is a starting class and later on has the job of Paladin. I will be going into more details about this in the next video, where I discuss the creation process of your character. Not all jobs in Final Fantasy XIV have a starting class. Additionally, a job in Final Fantasy XIV unlocks more advanced skills available to your character. In Final Fantasy XIV, you are not restricted to having only one class or job. You can choose to unlock all of them with one character. However, you can only have one class or job active at once. What I mean by active is this: I cannot use my skills for, say, ninja with my paladin job. For example, if my paladin is my active job, I would have access to the paladin skills, but I would not have access to use the ninja skills with my paladin. Likewise, if ninja was my active job, I would then have access to the ninja skills, and I would not be able to use the paladin skills with my ninja. Some skills are shared between classes and jobs that share the same role. For example, all tanks have access to tank role actions. I will explain more about role actions in a future video. In Final Fantasy XIV, there are different icons that represent the different combat-based roles. For example, the shield represents tanks. Additionally, each class and job has an icon that represents their corresponding class and job. For example, the icon for Gladiator is the crossed swords, while the icon for Paladin is a shield with a line through it. Note the differences between the shield of a tank icon and the shield of the Paladin icon. In Final Fantasy XIV, experience is earned by defeating enemies, participating in fates, completing quests, exploration, completing dungeons, completing trials, etc., and is awarded to your current active class or job. If a job has a base class, the experience earned will be shown as experience earned for that base class. For example, if Paladin was my active job, the experience that I gain is shown as Gladiator experience. Alternatively, if I had Dark Knight as my active job, the experience I gained would be shown as Dark Knight experience, as Dark Knight does not have a base class. A tank is a high defense class or job that usually leads the party throughout dungeons or various content in a game. The tank's primary objective is to attract the attention of all the opponents to themselves and away from the rest of the group. The group is also known as a party. Having the tank attract the attention of the opponents is also known as having the hate, enmity, or aggro of the opponents. In Final Fantasy XIV, it is called enmity, although you will see other players, including myself, using these terms interchangeably. In Final Fantasy XIV, there are currently 4 different tank jobs. 2 of these tank jobs have a starting class, which are available to choose as you create your character. These classes and jobs are as follows. Gladiator is a sword and shield class, which later becomes the Paladin job. The shorthand of Gladiator is GLD, and the shorthand of Paladin is PLD. Marauder is an axe-wielding class, which later becomes the Warrior job. The shorthand of Marauder is MRD, and the shorthand of Warrior is WAR. Dark Knight is a great sword-wielding job, which is available when you own the Heavensward expansion. However, like with Astrologian and Machinist, which I will mention later, in order to gain access to unlock the job, you will need to progress in the main scenario quest, also known as MSQ. The shorthand of Dark Knight is DRK. Gunbreaker is a gunblade-wielding job, which is available when you own the Shadowbringers expansion and after you have reached level 60 with any class or job. The shorthand of Gunbreaker is GNB. A healer is, as the name implies, the class or job that heals the party when they take damage. Healers will also have their own damage skills to use, but their primary focus is to keep the party alive with their healing skills. Specifically, healers should focus on keeping the tank alive. In turn, this generally keeps the whole party alive. Healers are low defense classes and jobs. In Final Fantasy XIV, there are currently 3 healing jobs. Only one of these is a starting healing class. The Arcanist class, which is a starting class, can eventually change to the Scholar job, which is one of the 3 healing jobs. A side note, Arcanist can also change to the Summoner job, which is a magical ranged DPS job. The healing jobs are as follows. Conjurer is a starting healing class, which later becomes the White Mage job. As a Conjurer or White Mage, up to level 50, you will be able to wield a wand and shield, or a 2-handed staff. After level 50, you will only be able to wield a 2-handed staff. The 2-handed staff is generally better to use. The shorthand of Conjurer is CNJ, and the shorthand of White Mage is WHM. Arcanist is a familiar summoning class, which later can become the Scholar job. Additionally, at the same time, Arcanist can also become the Summoner job, which is a magical DPS job. You can have both a Scholar and a Summoner job. Arcanists, Scholars, and Summoners all use Grimoires in addition to Familiars. If you level up your Scholar, you will also be leveling up your Summoner, or vice versa. The reason for this is because they both share the Arcanist base class. This is true if you have not unlocked Scholar, but you have unlocked Summoner, or vice versa. The shorthand of Arcanist is ACN, and the shorthand of Scholar is SCH. Astrologian is a job that uses a star globe as a weapon. This job becomes available when you own the Heavensward expansion. Like with Dark Knight and Machinist, you will need to progress in the main scenario quest, also known as MSQ, before you will be able to unlock this job. The shorthand of Astrologian is AST. DPS, which stands for damage per second, are the classes and jobs that do the most damage to opponents. DPS are high damage output classes and jobs. Their primary focus is to, as their name implies, do the most damage per second that they can. Now, this does not have to be a perfectly mathematically played role. With the DPS classes and jobs, there are generally skills that are boosted when used in a combination to output more damage than if these skills were used separately. This is also true for other classes and jobs, but it is especially important for DPS. The DPS's primary focus should be to do as much damage as quickly as possible. How they go about this will depend on the given situation. For example, in the case of Final Fantasy XIV, DPS have skills that are good against single opponent or multiple opponents. If a DPS is facing against a single opponent, it is, as one might assume, better for that DPS to use the skills that are better versus single opponents. Whereas, if that DPS was facing against more than one opponent, then it generally is better for that DPS to use their skills that are better versus multiple opponents. Skills that are used against multiple opponents at once are often called AoE skills, Area of Effect. If an opponent is within the range of the skill when it is used, the opponent will take damage specific to the skill's ability. For example, some of the DPS Area of Effect, or AoE skills, do more damage to the targeted opponent, while doing a bit less to the other opponents within the range of the skill. In the case of Final Fantasy XIV, tanks, healers, and DPS all have AoE abilities. However, they are not all available at the same time. That is, some of these skills are not available until that class or job is a higher level. As I mentioned earlier, in Final Fantasy XIV, the DPS are divided into 3 different subdivisions. They are as follows: melee DPS, physical ranged DPS, and magical ranged DPS. Melee DPS are up-close and personal DPS classes and jobs. There are currently 4 melee DPS jobs in Final Fantasy XIV. They are as follows. Pugilist is a close-quarters combat class which later becomes the monk job. Pugilists and monks use knuckle weapons. The shorthand of Pugilist is PGL, and the shorthand for monk is MNK. Lancer is a lance-wielding class, as the name might suggest, which later becomes the Dragoon job. The shorthand of Lancer is LNC, and the shorthand of Dragoon is DRG. Rogue is a double-dagger-wielding class, which becomes the ninja job. Unlike the other classes, this job is not currently available when you create your character. The Rogue class becomes available once you reach level 10 with any class. However, if you did not start in the city Limsa Lominsa, you will have to progress in the main scenario quest before you will be able to unlock this class. I will explain more about the differences in starting classes and when they start in the game in the next video. The shorthand of Rogue is ROG, and the shorthand of Ninja is NIN. Samurai is a katana-wielding job, which becomes available when you own the Stormblood expansion, and after you have reached level 50 with any class or job. The shorthand of Samurai is SAM. Physical ranged DPS are the classes and jobs that use ranged skills that are not magical. There are currently 3 physical ranged DPS in Final Fantasy XIV. They are as follows. Archer is a starting class, which later becomes the Bard job. The weapon that they use is, of course, a bow. The shorthand of Archer is ARC, and the shorthand of Bard is BRD. Machinist is a job that becomes available when you own the Heavensward expansion. However, like with Dark Knight and Astrologian, you will need to progress in the main scenario quest, also known as MSQ, before you will be able to unlock this job. Machinists use a gun as a weapon. The shorthand of Machinist is MCH. Dancer is a job that becomes available when you own the Shadowbringers expansion, and after you have reached level 60 with any class or job. Dancers use throwing weapons, primarily chakrams. The shorthand of Dancer is DNC. Magical ranged DPS are the classes and jobs that use ranged magical attacks. There are currently 4 magical ranged DPS jobs. They are as follows. Thaumaturge is a class that later becomes the Black Mage job. Thaumaturges use wands and shields, or two-handed staffs. Like Conjurer and White Mage, after level 50, only two-handed staffs will be able to be used. The two-handed staffs are generally better to use. The shorthand of Thaumaturge is THM, and the shorthand of Black Mage is BLM. Summoner is a job that becomes available after leveling Arcanist to level 30. Like with Arcanist and Scholar, Summoners use grimoires as their weapon in addition to familiars. The shorthand of Summoner is SMN. Red Mage is a job which becomes available when you own the Stormblood expansion and after you have reached level 50 with any class or job. Red Mages use a hybrid of ranged and melee skills. They use red magic for their magical skills, and they use rapiers for their melee skills. The shorthand of Red Mage is RDM. Blue Mage is a limited job. That is, it works differently than all the other classes and jobs. For example, rather than learning skills through leveling or through class or job quests, Blue Mage learns different actions and abilities by defeating enemies. In order to unlock Blue Mage, you will need to complete the main scenario quest, The Ultimate Weapon. Additionally, the Blue Mage is restricted to what content it can do, but I will get into that in a different video. The shorthand of Blue Mage is BLU. In Final Fantasy XIV, upon reaching level 15 in any Disciple of War or Disciple of Magic class, you will be able to access a system called Hall of Novice. In order to access this system, you will need to speak with the NPC, the Smith. NPC stands for non-player character. The Smith NPC is located in each of the starting cities and a few other locations. The Hall of Novice has a list of training exercises for each of the combat roles, specifically tanks, healers, and DPS. I highly recommend doing these training exercises even if you are a veteran to MMOs, or even if you are a veteran to Final Fantasy XIV in general. Not only are these good introductions to the responsibilities of your role, but these lessons also give really good gear that are useful throughout levels 15 through 20-ish. The gear awarded is different for those in the Disciple of War and Disciple of Magic categories. Disciple of War gear is different for tanks, melee DPS, and physical ranged DPS. Thus, you will need to do the Hall of Novice lessons with one class or job with each of these different roles to acquire the different gear. A final reward to the lessons is also a ring that grants a bonus to experience earned by 30% while at or below level 30 for Disciple of War or Magic classes. This ring is a unique ring, so you cannot have more than one of them. If you happen to lose the ring, you will be able to acquire a new one. If you happen to start a job that is a new role to you but is higher than level 15, I still recommend doing the Hall of Novice lessons for that role. I have mentioned a few times about Disciple of War and the Disciple of Magic categories. These categories specifically refer to the combat classes and jobs in Final Fantasy XIV, while the Disciple of Hand and Disciple of Land categories refer to the non-combat classes. In summary, there are different roles in MMOs. Final Fantasy has 3 primary combat roles: tank, healer, and DPS. Additionally, Final Fantasy XIV has non-combat roles, crafting and gathering. Tanks are heavy defense classes and jobs, healers are the healing and low defense classes and jobs, DPS are the high damage output classes and jobs. The Hall of Novice is a great system of training exercises to learn more about each of these combat-based roles. Additionally, it is a great asset to acquire gear for levels 15 through 20-ish. In Final Fantasy XIV, the different roles are divided into different categories: Disciple of War, Disciples of Magic, Disciples of Hand, and Disciples of Land. With all that said, this is where I'm going to end this video. What is something you wished you knew when you first started playing MMOs, or started playing Final Fantasy XIV? Is there anything I missed? Please leave a comment below with your thoughts or questions. In the next video of this series, I will be explaining how the character creation process works and information that you will want to pay attention to when creating your character. The video after that will be explaining in more details other features in Final Fantasy XIV, in addition to some beginner basics for each of the combat roles, that is, for tanks, healers, and DPS. If you have any questions or comments regarding anything that I mentioned in this video, or anything in general about MMOs, or Final Fantasy XIV specifically, please leave a comment down below with your question or comment. If you like or found this video helpful, please hit that like button. If you would like to continue learning more about MMOs or Final Fantasy XIV in general, please consider subscribing and hit that notification bell so that you don't miss future videos like this. Thanks for watching!